On the morning of November 11th, 1975, the elected Prime Minister of Australia, Gough Whitlam, walked into Government House in Canberra expecting a routine meeting with the Governor-General. He had been summoned to discuss timing for a half-Senate election, a procedural matter that should have taken 20 minutes. But what happened inside that room was anything but routine. The Governor-General, Sir John Kerr, a man Whitlam himself had personally appointed just 18 months earlier, handed him a letter. The letter informed Whitlam that his commission as Prime Minister had been terminated, effective immediately. No warning, no negotiation, no vote of the people, just a piece of paper and a handshake. And within hours, the leader of the opposition, Malcolm Fraser, a man who had never won a general election, was installed as the new Prime Minister of Australia. Outside Parliament House, as the news spread, Whitlam stood on the steps and delivered one of the most famous lines in Australian political history. "Well, may we say God save the Queen," he told the stunned crowd, "because nothing will save the Governor-General." It was the most dramatic political act in Australian history. It was also, depending on who you believe, one of the most successful covert operations the CIA ever ran. And when you start pulling at the threads of how it actually happened, the story you find is far more disturbing, far more interconnected, and far more relevant to understanding how power really works than almost anything taught in a political science classroom. Now, the official version of this story is well known. It is a constitutional crisis, a rogue Senate blocking the government's budget, a Governor-General exercising obscure reserve powers to break the deadlock. And all of that is technically true, as far as it goes. But here's the thing. That version of the story leaves out the most important characters. It leaves out the CIA. It leaves out a top-secret American spy base buried in the Australian desert. It leaves out a threatening cable sent from Langley just days before the dismissal. And it leaves out a pattern of covert interference that stretches from Santiago, Chile, to Jakarta, Indonesia, to Canberra, Australia. Because this was never just a constitutional dispute over parliamentary procedure. It was, at its core, a story about sovereignty, about intelligence infrastructure, and about what happens when an elected leader of a small allied nation threatens the strategic interests of the most powerful country on earth. And to understand what really happened in November of 1975, you have to go back much further than the budget crisis. You have to go back to the desert, you have to follow the cables, and you have to follow the money. So let us go back, not to 1975, but to 1966. Because that is when the seeds of this crisis were quietly planted in the red dirt of central Australia, roughly 20 kilometers southwest of Alice Springs, in the Northern Territory. In that year, under a conservative Australian government that had been in power for nearly 2 decades, the United States and Australia signed a secret agreement to build a facility in one of the most remote places on the continent. The facility was called Pine Gap. Its official name was the Joint Defense Space Research Facility. And if you have never heard of Pine Gap, that is entirely by design. For years, the Australian public was told almost nothing about what happened inside it. The word research in its name was a deliberate misdirection. In reality, Pine Gap was one of the most important intelligence installations on the face of the Earth. It was a ground station for CIA-operated surveillance satellites. Its massive radomes, those white golf ball-shaped structures visible from the air, housed antennas that tracked Soviet and Chinese missile tests in real time. It intercepted signals intelligence across the entire Asia-Pacific region. It provided early warning data that fed directly into the American nuclear command structure. One former CIA officer later described Pine Gap as the single most valuable piece of real estate the United States held outside its own borders. And here's the critical detail that makes everything else in this story make sense. The original agreement for Pine Gap was signed for a term of 10 years. That lease was due for renewal on December 10th, 1975. I want you to keep that date in the front of your mind, because it explains almost everything that came after. Now, Pine Gap was not the only American installation on Australian soil. There was also Nurungar, a satellite early warning station built into the hills of South Australia, roughly 500 kilometers north of Adelaide. Nurungar tracked ballistic missile launches across the Eastern Hemisphere. If the Soviet Union fired a nuclear weapon, Nurungar would be one of the first facilities in the world to detect it. And then there was the Naval Communications Station at Northwest Cape, on the remote tip of Western Australia. This facility transmitted extremely low-frequency signals to American nuclear submarines patrolling the Indian and Pacific Oceans. In other words, it was part of the communications chain for launching a nuclear strike. Together, these 3 facilities made Australia one of the most strategically important territories in the entire Western Alliance. They were not optional. They were not nice to have. They were the backbone of America's surveillance and deterrence architecture in the Southern Hemisphere. The backbone of the Five Eyes Alliance, the intelligence-sharing network that linked the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand into a single signals intelligence apparatus. And for 23 uninterrupted years, from 1949 to 1972, Conservative Australian governments had kept these arrangements running smoothly. The Americans had their bases. The intelligence flowed freely. No Australian Prime Minister asked uncomfortable questions about what was actually happening inside those redomes. And then, in December of 1972, the Australian people elected Gough Whitlam. And from Washington's perspective, everything started to go wrong. Whitlam was not just a new prime minister. He was a rupture in the political fabric of a country that had been one of America's most reliable Cold War allies. After more than 2 decades of conservative rule, Australia had elected a Labour leader who seemed determined to remake the country from the foundations up. He introduced Medibank, Australia's first universal healthcare system. He abolished university tuition fees overnight. He ended military conscription. He passed the first major land rights legislation for Aboriginal Australians. He lowered the voting age to 18, and then he turned to foreign policy, which is where the real trouble began. Whitlam formally recognized the People's Republic of China, something that infuriated Washington at a time when the United States was still navigating the delicate politics of its own opening to Beijing. He pulled the last Australian military advisors out of Vietnam, and his cabinet ministers publicly and furiously condemned the American bombing of Hanoi during the Christmas of 1972. One minister called it the most brutal act of violence in modern history. Now, any one of these moves, taken in isolation, would have raised eyebrows in the State Department and at Langley. But taken together, they represented something far more threatening than a policy disagreement. Whitlam was signaling, in the loudest possible terms, that Australia would no longer function as an unquestioning satellite of American strategic interests. He was asserting independence, and in the world of Cold War intelligence, independence was the most dangerous word an Allied leader could speak. And here's where the story gets deeply uncomfortable. Because Whitlam did not stop at policy changes. He started looking into what the intelligence agencies were actually doing inside his own country. On March 16, 1973, his Attorney General, Lionel Murphy, led a series of unannounced police raids on the headquarters of ASIO, the Australian Security Intelligence Organization, in both Canberra and Melbourne. The raids were ostensibly about seizing files on Croatian extremist groups that had been carrying out bombings on Australian soil. But the real shock was not what Murphy was looking for. It was what the raids represented. For the first time in the history of the Five Eyes Alliance, an elected leader was physically breaking down the door of his own intelligence services, demanding to see what they had been hiding. The CIA and MI6 were reportedly furious, not about Croatian terrorists, about what else might be in those filing cabinets, what connections between ASIO, the CIA, and Australian political parties might be exposed if a prime minister started treating his own spy agencies as organizations that were accountable to democratic government. And their fears were well-founded, because Whitlam soon discovered something that would bring him into a direct and irreversible confrontation with the CIA. He discovered that the agency had been secretly funneling money to the Australian political opposition. Specifically, the National Country Party, a conservative junior coalition partner, had been receiving covert American funding. This was not an abstraction or a rumor. This was a foreign intelligence agency directly interfering in the democratic process of a sovereign allied nation. Whitlam was incensed, and he said so publicly. He also discovered that the Australian Secret Intelligence Service, ASIS, Australia's equivalent of the CIA itself, had been operating as a covert proxy for the Americans in Chile, helping to destabilize the democratically elected government of Salvador Allende. Allende, of course, was overthrown in September of 1973 in a CIA-backed military coup that installed the dictator Augusto Pinochet. Thousands were killed, tortured, or disappeared. And Australia's own intelligence service had been part of the machinery. Whitlam ordered ASIS to immediately cease all unauthorized operations, and he began publicly criticizing the CIA's role in Chile, drawing the obvious parallel to what could happen in any small country that displeased Washington. This was, to put it mildly, not how things were supposed to work in the Five Eyes world. The prime minister of a member nation was not supposed to expose CIA operations. He was supposed to facilitate them. He was supposed to look the other way, and Gough Whitlam was not looking the other way. Now here is the critical thing that most accounts of the dismissal either gloss over or mention only in passing. By late 1975, Whitlam was not just a political irritant to the CIA. He was an existential threat, and that threat had a very specific deadline. The Pine Gap lease was set to expire on December 10, 1975. Whitlam had publicly demanded greater transparency about CIA activities at the base. He had threatened not to renew the lease, and he had told colleagues in the Australian Labour Party that he intended to name CIA operatives working covertly inside Australia. For the American intelligence establishment, this was not a diplomatic disagreement. This was a full-blown crisis. Pine Gap was irreplaceable. There was no alternative site anywhere in the world that could replicate its geographic position, its satellite coverage, its role in the nuclear command chain. Losing Pine Gap would have torn a hole in the entire Western surveillance architecture at the most dangerous period of the Cold War, and this is where the most damning piece of evidence enters the story. Sometime around November 8th to the 10th of 1975, just days, possibly hours, before the dismissal, Ted Shackley, the CIA's East Asia Division chief, sent a top-secret cable to ASIO. The contents of that cable, which have been described by multiple sources, including former intelligence officials, were extraordinary. Shackley essentially declared the elected Prime Minister of Australia a security risk to his own country. The cable stated that if Whitlam continued on his current path, if he exposed CIA operatives or jeopardized the Pine Gap facility, the United States would sever the intelligence sharing relationship with Australia entirely. Cut off from Five Eyes. Cast out of the most powerful intelligence alliance in the world. Isolated, vulnerable. The cable was not a suggestion, it was an ultimatum. And it landed in the hands of people who had every reason and every means to act on it. Now, let us talk about the man who actually wielded the constitutional knife. Sir John Kerr, the Governor-General who dismissed Whitlam. On the surface, Kerr was a distinguished jurist, a man of law and constitutional propriety. But here is what the official story conveniently omits. Before his appointment as Governor-General, Kerr had served on the executive board of the Australian Association for Cultural Freedom. This was not what its name suggested. It was a CIA-front organization, part of the broader Congress for Cultural Freedom, which was funded covertly by the CIA through a network of shell foundations to shape intellectual and political opinion in dozens of countries during the Cold War. This is not a conspiracy theory. This is documented, acknowledged history. The CIA's funding of the Congress for Cultural Freedom was first exposed in 1967 by Ramparts magazine and was later confirmed by the agency itself. John Kerr sat on the board of its Australian chapter. He had deep, long-standing connections to the intelligence world. And the man the United States chose to send to Canberra to manage the Whitlam problem was equally telling. Marshall Green was appointed U.S. ambassador to Australia in 1973. Green was a career diplomat with a very specific kind of resume. He had been posted in Indonesia during the 1965 military coup that overthrew Sukarno and led to the massacre of an estimated 500,000 to 1 million people. He had been posted in South Korea during periods of acute political upheaval. In diplomatic circles, Green was known by a nickname that was not meant as a compliment. They called him the coupmaster. Make of that what you will. Now, the mechanism that was ultimately used to bring Whitlam down was, on its surface, a domestic political scandal, the Khimlani loans affair. In late 1974, Whitlam's Minister for Minerals and Energy, Rex Connor, had been secretly negotiating to secure approximately $4 billion in overseas loans, primarily from Middle Eastern petrodollar sources, through a London-based Pakistani commodities broker named Tirath Khimlani. The purpose of these loans was extraordinary in its ambition. Connor wanted to buy back Australian mineral and energy assets from foreign multinational corporations. He wanted to nationalize Australia's own resource wealth, to ensure that the profits from Australian iron ore, uranium, and natural gas flowed to the Australian people rather than to shareholders in London and New York. It was a direct challenge to the multinational mining companies that had dominated Australia's resource sector for decades. The scheme was poorly managed, conducted through unauthorized channels, and when it was exposed through a series of leaked telexes, it was politically devastating. Connor was forced to resign. Deputy Prime Minister Jim Cairns was also removed over related financial irregularities. The opposition, led by Malcolm Fraser, seized on the scandal and used the Senate to block supply, refusing to pass the government's annual appropriations bill. This created a constitutional deadlock. And that deadlock became the legal pretext that Sir John Kerr used to dismiss Whitlam on November 11th, 1975. But here is the uncomfortable truth. The dismissal happened exactly 29 days before the Pine Gap lease was due for renewal. 29 days. Malcolm Fraser, the man who replaced Whitlam without ever winning an election, renewed the Pine Gap lease without hesitation, without conditions, and without a single public question about what the CIA was doing inside the facility. Pine Gap continued to operate. The CIA's most valuable installation in the Southern Hemisphere was secured, and the man who had threatened to expose it all was standing on the steps of Parliament House, removed from power. Years later, a young American named Christopher Boyce provided some of the most explosive testimony on the question of CIA involvement. Boyce had worked as a code clerk at TRW, a defense contractor that operated communication systems linked to Pine Gap. He had handled classified CIA traffic on a daily basis. After his arrest in 1977 for selling secrets to the Soviet Union, the case that journalist Robert Lindsay turned into the book The Falcon and the Snowman, Boyce made a series of extraordinary claims under oath. He said that CIA cables he had personally handled discussed covert interference in Australian domestic politics, including the systematic infiltration of Australian trade unions and political organizations. And he claimed that internal CIA communications referred to Governor General Sir John Kerr by a phrase that has haunted this story ever since. Our man Kerr. The CIA has denied this characterization, but Boyce's testimony, given under penalty of perjury, remains one of the most cited pieces of evidence in the case for American involvement. Former CIA officer Victor Marchetti went even further. In interviews with the investigative journalist John Pilger, Marchetti stated that Whitlam's threat to close Pine Gap caused, in his exact words, apoplexy in the White House. And he described what followed as a kind of Chile being set in motion. Not a military coup, but a covert destabilization operation using constitutional mechanisms, media manipulation, and intelligence assets already in place. Pilger documented these claims extensively in his landmark 1989 book, A Secret Country, which remains one of the most comprehensive investigations ever conducted into CIA activity in Australia. The American historian William Blum catalogued the Australian dismissal alongside dozens of other Cold War-era interventions in his sweeping study of U.S. foreign policy. And Professor Jenny Hawking of Monash University, who spent years writing the definitive biography of Gough Whitlam, would eventually uncover what may be the most significant piece of this puzzle: the Palace Letters. For over 4 decades, the correspondence between Governor General Kerr and Queen Elizabeth II, conducted through her private secretary Sir Martin Charteris, was locked away in the National Archives of Australia under a royal embargo. They were classified as personal papers, not Commonwealth records, and therefore not subject to public access. The Australian government, the archives, and Buckingham Palace all fought to keep them sealed. But Professor Hawking launched a legal battle that lasted 4 grueling years, taking the case from the federal court all the way to the High Court of Australia. And in May of 2020, the High Court ruled 6-1 that the letters were Commonwealth records and must be released. What they revealed was devastating to the official narrative. The letters showed that Kerr had been secretly discussing his plans to dismiss Whitlam with the palace for months before the crisis reached its climax. He had been seeking validation, even encouragement, for the use of reserve powers. And the palace, through Charteris, had effectively given him the green light, assuring him that his position as Governor General would be protected regardless of the political fallout. All of this was happening while Kerr was telling Whitlam to his face that he would never exercise reserve powers without giving the Prime Minister fair warning. He was deceiving the elected leader of Australia while conspiring with the Crown behind his back. Now, fast forward to today. Pine Gap has not only survived, it has expanded massively. The facility now employs over 1,000 personnel and operates as a critical node in America's global drone strike program and its network of signals, intelligence satellites. Its role has grown far beyond Cold War missile tracking. It is now central to the surveillance architecture of the entire digital age. The Five Eyes Alliance, the intelligence sharing network that Whitlam threatened to disrupt, is stronger and more deeply integrated than at any point in its history. And the strategic relationship between the United States and Australia has deepened to levels that would have been unthinkable in 1975, culminating most recently in the AUKUS Pact, a trilateral security agreement between Australia, the United Kingdom, and the United States that will see Australia acquire nuclear-powered submarines at a cost estimated to exceed 360 billion Australian dollars. The pattern is clear, and it is a pattern that repeats across decades and across continents. When a small democratic nation hosts infrastructure that is vital to the strategic interests of a superpower, the sovereignty of that nation exists only so long as it does not conflict with those interests. The moment it does, the machinery activates, not with tanks or troops in the streets, but with cables and constitutions. Not with generals, but with governors general. The next time someone tells you that the dismissal of Gough Whitlam was simply a constitutional crisis, an obscure legal procedure triggered by a budget dispute in the Australian Senate, remember this. Remember that the Pine Gap lease was 29 days from expiring. Remember the Shackley cable. Remember that the Governor General sat on the board of a CIA-front organization. Remember that the U.S. ambassador to Canberra was nicknamed the coupmaster. Remember that the palace letters were hidden for 45 years and had to be pried loose by a court order. And remember that the man who replaced Whitlam renewed the American lease without a single question asked. This is not a conspiracy theory. This is documented history. And to understand it, you do not start with the Constitution. You start with the spy base in the desert, you follow the cables, and you follow the money. If this story changed the way you think about how democracies are really managed behind the scenes, I would genuinely appreciate it if you hit that subscribe button. We are pulling apart the financial and intelligence forces that shape the modern world, the ones that rarely make it into the official account. Drop a like and leave a comment telling me what surprised you most. Was it the Shackley cable, the palace letters, or the fact that the man they sent to manage Whitlam was literally called the coupmaster? I read every single one. I will see you in the next one.